It was a typical morning. The sun was barely peeking through the clouds as my mother walked out to get the mail, just like she had every other day. A simple task, one that should have been uneventful. But in a blink of an eye, everything changed. My mother, shot in the head, right in front of our house, by someone who lived just a few doors down. Someone who didn't know her, didn't care to know her, and yet, believed she was a criminal. All because she picked up her own mail. She didn't even see it coming. This is the story of how a quiet neighborhood, a peaceful morning, and a mother's innocence were shattered in an instant. How a simple misunderstanding led to a devastating tragedy, one that left us questioning everything we thought we knew about trust, safety, and the people who live next door. This is the story of how an HOA Karen changed our lives forever. My mother, Maria, was more than just a parent, she was the center of our world. She had this way of making everything feel better, even when things seemed at their worst. Her kindness wasn't just a trait, it was her essence. She had a warm smile that could light up a room, and no one who crossed her path ever left without feeling a little better. Whether it was helping a neighbor with groceries, sending a homemade pie to someone sick, or simply offering a listening ear, she was the person everyone turned to in times of need. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business, where kids played outside until dusk, and where people would wave as they drove by. It was the kind of place where you'd stop and chat with a neighbor while picking up your mail, where a simple "hello" was the most common greeting. We had our own little community, tightly knit, but perhaps a little too tightly. Mom was always the heartbeat of that community. Her name was spoken fondly by those who lived around us, whether they were old friends or new faces. "Sweet Maria," they'd say, "she's the kindest person you'll ever meet." And she truly was. She had a way of making you feel special, like you mattered. But despite her kindness, there were those who didn't see her for who she was. There were those who didn't know her at all, like Karen, the HOA president. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for a few years, but she'd never really connected with anyone. She didn't like the noise, didn't like the kids running through the yards, didn't like the way people lived their lives outside of her narrow view of proper. Karen was the type of person who saw herself as the enforcer of rules, a self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's purity. It didn't matter to her that we were good people, that we paid our dues, or that we kept to ourselves. To Karen, we were just another family breaking her idea of order. Little did we know, that very idea was about to explode into something none of us could have ever predicted. I've often wondered if the kindness my mother showed every single day was what led to her downfall. If the very things that made her so lovable also made her a target for someone who thought they had the power to dictate who belonged and who didn't. It was a Thursday morning, just like any other. The kind of day where you don't expect anything to go wrong. The air was crisp, a faint chill lingering in the breeze as the first signs of autumn began to creep in. The sky was covered in a blanket of gray clouds, casting an almost eerie stillness over the neighborhood. The street was quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves to break the silence. It was a peaceful morning, one that promised nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what we all thought. I was inside, sipping my coffee, staring at the muted news on the television. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the ticking seeming to echo through the empty house. My mind wandered, as it often did, thinking about all the little things that made up the rhythm of our lives. But none of those thoughts mattered in the end, because, outside, something was unfolding that would shatter everything we thought we knew. My mother, Maria, had just stepped outside to get the mail. She always did it at the same time every morning, a small, simple routine. Nothing special, nothing alarming. Just a woman, in her late 50s, in a cozy sweater, walking out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I didn't even look up as she stepped out the door, I was lost in my own world, in my own thoughts. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that across the street, Karen, the HOA president, was watching her. Karen had always been the type of person to keep to herself, rarely engaging with the neighbors. She didn't have any close friends on the block. In fact, many of us found her to be a little off-putting. She prided herself on maintaining order, making sure everyone followed the rules. No children playing in the yards after dusk, no loud music on weekends, no decorations outside that didn't adhere to the HOA guidelines. She was, for all intents and purposes, the enforcer of the neighborhood's unspoken code. And yet, despite her power and influence, no one really took her seriously. She was more of a figurehead, someone people tolerated but never truly feared. But today, something had changed. Karen had been watching my mother for the past few days. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Karen had always been a little strange, but she had never done anything that raised real suspicion. However, on this particular morning, she was on edge. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, as she stood in her window, peering out at my mother. What she saw was a woman, walking casually toward the mailbox. To anyone else, it would have seemed like nothing more than an ordinary moment. But to Karen, something didn't feel right. She watched as my mother bent down to grab the stack of letters. And in that moment, something in Karen snapped. Maybe it was the way my mother moved. Maybe it was the way the envelope looked in her hand. To Karen, it wasn't just mail. It was a sign of something darker, something threatening. Perhaps it was paranoia, or maybe it was a deep-seated belief that something was always lurking beneath the surface. But in her mind, my mother wasn't a neighbor collecting her mail. No, in her eyes, she was a burglar. And that's when everything began to spiral out of control. Karen, convinced that my mother was up to no good, made a decision that would change everything. Without thinking, without questioning, she grabbed her gun from the drawer, an old relic that had always been tucked away. She hadn't planned on using it. Hell, she had never even considered the possibility that she might ever need it. But today, the fear had overtaken her. She was no longer just the HOA president enforcing trivial rules. She was a self-appointed protector, and my mother was the threat. I still remember the moment I heard the shot. A loud bang that shattered the stillness of the morning. It was a sound I'll never forget, the kind that makes your heart drop into your stomach, the kind that makes your blood run cold. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, the world came rushing back in a blur of chaos. I raced to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it, my mother, crumpled on the ground, blood seeping from her head, her eyes wide open in disbelief. Karen stood there, frozen, her hand still gripping the gun, as if in some kind of trance. And in that moment, everything went silent. The world outside had come to a halt. What should have been a peaceful morning, a simple walk to the mailbox, had turned into something unthinkable. Karen thought she had stopped a criminal. But all she had done was destroy an innocent life. The shot came out of nowhere. A single loud bang that shattered the peace of the morning. My body froze, my mind trying to process the unimaginable. For a split second, I didn't know what was happening. Was it fireworks? A car backfiring? But no, this was different. This was real. Then I heard it. The scream. My mother's scream. A raw, guttural cry that sent terror straight through me. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of shock, of confusion. And it was followed by an eerie silence. The kind of silence that felt suffocating. I rushed to the door, adrenaline pumping through my veins, my heart hammering in my chest. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted outside. The world around me seemed to move in slow motion. I reached the front steps, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the horrifying scene unfold before me. My mother was lying on the ground, motionless. Her body had jerked forward from the impact of the bullet. Blood was pooling beneath her, a dark crimson that stained the concrete in an ever-growing puddle. Her eyes were wide open, but they were unfocused, empty. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was still. And that was when the full weight of it hit me. She had been shot. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly as I stood there, staring at her, helpless. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound escaped my throat. My body wouldn't move. Everything inside me was screaming, but nothing came out. Karen. I looked across the street and saw her standing in the doorway of her house. The gun was still in her hand, her fingers trembling as she clutched it with an almost frantic grip. She stood frozen, as if the reality of what she had just done hadn't yet sunk in. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but also something else. Was it fear? Regret? Or had she already convinced herself that this was justified? That my mother had been the threat she'd imagined? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't look away from my mother, lying there, blood still trickling from her wound. The sight of it, the knowledge that someone had deliberately done this, it was too much. I felt my stomach twist, my body shaking uncontrollably. My thoughts were a whirlwind, crashing into one another with no clear direction. But one thought stood out, clear and unyielding: I needed to get to her. I rushed to my mother's side, dropping to my knees beside her. I placed my hands on her cold skin, my mind screaming for something, anything, to bring her back. But there was nothing. No breath, no movement. She was gone. My hands were stained with her blood as I tried to stop it, pressing down on the wound, but it was no use. Her life was slipping away with every passing second. My world, our world, was slipping away. Why? I whispered, not even sure who I was asking. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. My mother had been shot in cold blood by someone she'd never even met. Someone who had only seen her as a threat, not as the kind-hearted woman she was. Someone who had mistaken kindness for danger. Karen stood there, her gaze locked on us. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't reach me. I couldn't hear her. I couldn't hear anything over the roaring in my ears, the ringing of the gunshot still echoing in my mind. My whole body was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but nothing felt real. It was as if I were watching everything unfold from outside my own body. The distant sound of sirens finally broke through the haze of shock. The police, the paramedics, they were coming. But it was too late. My mother wasn't coming back. The woman who had been the heart and soul of our family was gone. I didn't know how long I sat there, holding her, as the world around me came alive with frantic energy. People had started to gather, murmuring in disbelief, but it all felt so distant, like I was living in a nightmare. Every movement seemed like it was happening to someone else, not me. Not us. Karen, still standing across the street, was now surrounded by police officers. Her face was pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she was escorted away. I saw her mouth moving, but no sound came out. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to know what she was thinking, what she was feeling. She had taken everything from us in a single moment. She had taken my mother's life because of her own delusions, her own twisted sense of control. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to make her understand what she had done. But instead, I just sat there, holding my mother, unable to comprehend how something so senseless could happen. How could someone, anyone, think that taking a life over a mistake, over a misunderstanding, was ever okay? As the paramedics arrived and began their futile attempts to revive my mother, I felt a sense of numbness wash over me. It was as if I were floating outside of myself, disconnected from the reality around me. I could hear the voices, see the flashing lights, but none of it seemed to matter. My mother was gone. And nothing, no matter how hard I tried, would bring her back. Karen thought she had stopped a burglar. But my mother wasn't a criminal. She was a mother, a neighbor, a friend. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, she had paid the ultimate price for someone's fear, someone's mistake. The blaring sirens were the first thing I heard as the paramedics and police arrived. It was a sound I had always associated with emergency situations, but now it felt out of place, detached from the reality of the situation. I was still kneeling on the ground beside my mother, her lifeless body in my arms. Time felt warped, each second stretched into eternity, and yet everything around me was moving at a pace that seemed impossibly fast. The police quickly began to cordon off the area, ushering neighbors back. Their faces were a blur, some confused, others tearful, all standing in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The community, which had once been so familiar, now felt foreign. These were the same neighbors who had waved at us over the years, who had smiled and exchanged pleasantries, and now they were all silent, unsure how to react to something this brutal. I didn't know what to do. I was numb. My mother was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't focus on anything, just the overwhelming sense of loss, the agony of realizing that the last time I'd seen her, she was standing at the door, smiling as she went to pick up the mail. As the paramedics worked on her, their attempts to revive her were futile. They pulled out all the stops, but I could see it in their eyes, they knew. They knew she was gone. One of them looked at me, his expression somber, and shook his head slightly. I had hoped, no, willed, them to do something, anything, to bring her back. But deep down, I knew the truth. The sound of Karen's voice broke through my thoughts. I had completely forgotten about her in the chaos. She was standing across the street, the gun still clutched in her trembling hands, her face pale as a ghost. The police had surrounded her, but she wasn't being arrested yet. Instead, she was speaking in hushed tones to one of the officers. Her words, though shaky, seemed almost rehearsed. I thought she was a burglar. I thought she was breaking into my house, she repeated over and over, her voice cracking each time. I wanted to scream at her. A burglar? My mother? My mother had been nothing but a good, kind woman who would never harm a soul. How could Karen have mistaken her for a criminal? How could she not have recognized the person she'd seen every day for the last 10 years? How could she have thought a woman picking up her mail was an intruder? But there I was, standing still, my body frozen in shock. There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to make Karen understand what she had done, but there was another part of me that was too exhausted to move. How could I process what had happened, let alone confront the person who had taken everything from me? The police began questioning Karen, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to her excuses. She kept repeating the same line, over and over, I thought she was a burglar. It was like she was trying to convince herself, as if that was enough of a reason to pull the trigger. But there was no reasoning with someone who had let fear cloud their judgment, someone who had taken my mother's life because of her own paranoia. The officer who had been talking to Karen now walked toward me. He was calm, professional, his demeanor polite but firm. He introduced himself, but his words didn't reach me at first. All I could hear was the noise in my head, the roaring rush of anger, the endless questions without answers, the overwhelming feeling of loss. My mind kept flashing back to that morning, to the moment my mother was shot. I could still hear her scream in my ears, feel the shock of it as it hit me. Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions, the officer said again, his voice breaking through my thoughts. Do you know if he gestured toward Karen, had any reason to believe your mother was doing something suspicious? I shook my head, still in disbelief. She wasn't doing anything. She was just getting the mail. This is insane. The officer nodded, taking a step back. His eyes softened for a moment, but it didn't change what had happened. It didn't bring my mother back. In the background, I could hear neighbors talking among themselves, their whispers laced with confusion and disbelief. Some were trying to make sense of the situation, others just stood silently, staring at the scene, unsure what to do. In the midst of the chaos, one woman approached me. She was a neighbor, someone I'd known for years, but her face was pale, her eyes swollen with tears. She tried to offer comfort, but all I could do was stare blankly ahead. My God, she said, her voice trembling. What happened? How could she? But I couldn't answer her. I couldn't explain it, because I didn't understand it myself. The anger and sadness were too much. How could Karen think that my mother, a woman who had spent her life helping others, was a burglar? How could anyone believe that a woman in her 50s, with a heart full of kindness, would pose any threat to anyone? Soon, the crime scene unit arrived, their blue lights flashing as they began to take over the scene. The officers moved Karen to a squad car, though she still looked dazed, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had just occurred. I watched her, my mind racing, wondering how anyone could be so blinded by their own assumptions. Couldn't she see what she had done? Didn't she know the consequences of her actions? It wasn't long before the detective assigned to the case approached me. He was a middle-aged man, his expression stern but understanding. He asked the same questions the officer had asked earlier, but I had no answers. The details were irrelevant now. My mother was dead. And all I could do was sit there, numb, trying to hold on to the fragments of what had once been a normal, peaceful life. The hours stretched on, and eventually, they took my mother's body away. They told me they would begin their investigation, that it would take time to piece together what had happened. But I didn't care about the investigation. I didn't care about what would happen to Karen. All I cared about was the woman who had been my mother, the woman who had been so full of life just hours before. She was gone, and there was nothing anyone could do to bring her back. The anger and grief didn't hit me fully until later that night, after everything had settled. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. It felt colder, darker. The community, which had always felt so familiar, was now filled with suspicion and uncertainty. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had seen the same side of Karen that I had, if they'd ever seen her for what she really was. I didn't know what would happen next. All I knew was that our lives had changed forever. And there would be no going back. As the days passed and the investigation continued, it became clear that this wasn't going to be an easy case to solve. I thought I knew everything about what had happened. Karen had made a terrible mistake, her fear had driven her to shoot my mother, and now the justice system would do its job. But as the weeks wore on, the truth began to reveal itself, layer by layer, like the peeling of an onion. And with each layer, things only got darker. It started with the small details, the things you wouldn't think twice about until someone pointed them out. Karen hadn't just shot my mother. She had shot her with precision. The bullet had entered my mother's head at an angle, as if Karen had been aiming for a specific spot. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The coroner's report confirmed what I had suspected. It wasn't a case of fear-driven panic. This was something more. But what? I remember sitting in the police station one afternoon, waiting for an update on the case, when a detective, Officer Thompson, approached me. He had been working the case from the beginning, and although he was professional, his eyes carried a weight of concern. There was something in his expression, something unspoken, that made me uneasy. "We're learning more about Karen," he said, sitting down beside me. "And I think it's time you knew the full story." I leaned forward, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? What more is there to know?" "Karen, she's not just the HOA president," Officer Thompson began, his voice low. "There's a history here, something we didn't realize at first. A history that's darker than just a misguided neighbor." My mind raced. I couldn't understand. What history? "It turns out Karen's obsession with the rules isn't just about the HOA," he continued. "It's deeper than that. She's been involved in several incidents before, things that were brushed under the rug, overlooked. In fact, there were allegations of violence in her past, domestic violence, to be specific. But nothing ever came of it. People just wrote it off as her controlling nature. I was stunned. Karen, the woman who had always seemed so prim and proper, the one who enforced the HOA rules with an iron fist, had a history of violence? How could I have missed that? How could we all have missed that? Officer Thompson leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are reports from previous neighbors, old ones who've moved away. They claim she had violent outbursts. One even mentioned a previous altercation with her husband, but it was never investigated properly. He left her years ago. No one knows exactly why." I felt a chill run down my spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make the picture any clearer. "She has been living here, under the radar, for years," Thompson continued. "She built this persona of a rule enforcer, someone everyone respected, but underneath that, she was dangerous. We found her old therapist records, too. She had been seeing someone for anger management, but again, that wasn't something anyone in the neighborhood knew. And the gun she used to shoot your mother? That was registered under a fake name. It's almost like she planned this, like she was waiting for the right moment to act on her impulses." I was speechless. My mind was reeling, trying to digest what Officer Thompson was telling me. How had we all been so blind to the signs? Karen had lived among us for years, but we only saw what she wanted us to see. A polite, reserved woman obsessed with order. But in reality, she was a ticking time bomb, a person with deep, unresolved issues, whose need for control had spiraled into something far darker. But even as I processed this new information, something didn't sit right with me. Was this really just about Karen's past? Was it just her history of violence and control that led her to shoot my mother, or was there something more to it? I decided to dig deeper, to find answers that no one had thought to look for. I spoke to people who knew Karen before she had moved into our neighborhood. I even managed to get my hands on some old documents, records from the HOA, dating back to when she first became president. What I found stunned me. Karen's behavior had been escalating for years, not just in her personal life, but within the HOA itself. She had been tightening her grip on the neighborhood, slowly but surely. Complaints from neighbors about her rigid enforcement of the rules had been piling up, and it seemed as though she was becoming more erratic with each passing month. But no one had connected the dots. No one had realized how dangerous she was becoming. And then, as I went through her personal records, I found something even more disturbing: Karen's obsession with my mother. There were notes, scribbled hastily in her own handwriting, hidden among some of the HOA files. Notes about my mother's unruly behavior, about how she ignored the rules by leaving her garden lights on too late or hosting too many social gatherings. The tone in the notes was chilling, almost as if Karen had been plotting her next move for months. But why my mother? What had she done to deserve this? The answer, I soon realized, was simpler than I had expected. My mother, in her kindness, had been a symbol of everything Karen wasn't. Where my mother was warm, generous, and loved by all, Karen was cold, controlling, and alone. My mother had everything Karen craved: respect, a community that cared about her, and a family who adored her. Karen was envious. Her jealousy had been building over time, and it had reached a breaking point. As I pieced these details together, I began to realize something even more unsettling: this wasn't just a tragic mistake. It was the culmination of years of jealousy, anger, and resentment. Karen had been living in a prison of her own making, and when she finally snapped, she chose my mother as the target of her rage. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I learned that Karen had recently been researching self-defense tactics, and had even purchased a concealed carry permit shortly before the incident. It wasn't just a random act of fear. It was premeditated. Karen had been planning this, waiting for the perfect opportunity to lash out. And when my mother innocently stepped outside to pick up her mail, Karen saw it as her chance. This wasn't just a tragic mistake. It was the terrifying result of a woman driven by envy, a woman whose desperation to maintain control had led her to commit the unthinkable. My mother's death wasn't just an accident. It was a calculated act of violence, born from years of simmering resentment. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the Karen I had known, the woman who seemed like just another neighbor, was far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The day of the trial had finally arrived. My heart was heavy, like it was made of lead, weighing me down with every step. It had been months since my mother's death, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that everything in my life had been turned upside down. The courtroom was filled with people, some familiar faces from the neighborhood, some strangers, but all of them here for the same reason: to witness justice. Or at least, to see if justice could ever be truly served. Karen sat on the opposite side of the room, her lawyer at her side. She had never once looked at me directly since that day, the day she shot my mother in cold blood. She sat there, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the floor, as though the weight of her guilt was somehow lighter if she didn't face it. I had spent the days leading up to this moment rehearsing what I would say, but now that I was finally here, I didn't know if I could. The anger, the pain, it was still too fresh. Every time I thought about that day, I could hear the gunshot ringing in my ears, see my mother lying on the ground, her life slipping away. I couldn't forget the look in Karen's eyes as she stood across the street, gun in hand, still in disbelief at what she had just done. I couldn't forget the shock in my mother's face, the betrayal in her eyes. And I couldn't forget the emptiness that followed. The trial began, and Karen's lawyer stood up first, attempting to paint her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had been provoked into shooting my mother. He tried to argue that Karen had acted out of fear, that she had been genuinely terrified when she saw my mother near her property. He tried to paint a picture of a frightened, vulnerable woman pushed to the edge by the overwhelming pressure of her HOA duties and the danger she thought my mother posed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout that my mother had been nothing but a peaceful, kind person who had done nothing wrong. But I stayed seated, clenching my fists under the table. I could feel the anger rising in me, threatening to overtake everything, but I held it in. I needed to keep my composure, for my mother, for the memory of who she had been. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my knees shaking. The weight of everyone's eyes on me felt suffocating, but I knew I had to do this. I had to make them understand who my mother had been, what she meant to me, to this community. Everyone who knew my mother loved her, I began, my voice steady but raw. She was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off her back if you needed it. She was a mother, a neighbor, a friend. She took care of everyone around her, and in return, she was loved by all of us. That's the woman Karen took from us. Not some criminal, not some burglar. But a woman who loved life and lived for others. I could feel the tears threatening to come, but I swallowed them down. This wasn't about my pain, it was about her pain, the pain my mother's death had caused, and the pain Karen had inflicted on all of us. I took a deep breath and continued. Karen shot my mother because of a misunderstanding, a fear she let grow in her mind. But this wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a mistaken identity. This was the result of years of jealousy, fear, and anger. My mother was an innocent woman. She didn't deserve to die because of someone's inability to see the truth. She didn't deserve to be seen as a threat for simply picking up her mail. And no amount of excuses will ever make what Karen did right. I paused for a moment, my eyes shifting to Karen. I finally met her gaze, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of her regret. Her eyes were empty, distant, and the arrogance that had once been so present in her expression was gone. It was replaced by something else, something darker. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the realization that she could no longer hide behind her lies. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. As I spoke, I could see Karen's face twitch with discomfort. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and I could tell she was trying to hold back tears. But I didn't care. I didn't care about her remorse or her regret. Because my mother was gone, and nothing would bring her back. Finally, the prosecutor stood up to make his argument, summarizing everything that had been said. He painted a picture of Karen's actions as cold, calculated, and deliberate. He reminded the court of Karen's history of violence, her obsessive nature, and her twisted sense of control over the neighborhood. He argued that what had happened that day was not a momentary lapse of judgment but the result of a mind consumed by fear and a need to dominate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the judge began his closing remarks. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for him to render his decision. My heart was racing. The entire room felt like it was closing in on me as I thought about what would happen next. Could justice really be served? Could we ever get closure from this tragedy? The judge's voice broke through the tension. I have heard all the evidence presented in this case, and I have considered the impact of these actions on both the victim's family and the defendant. What we are dealing with here is a tragic loss of life, and while Karen's fear was real, it does not justify the taking of an innocent person's life. I held my breath as the judge continued, his words echoing in the silence. Karen, you acted out of a fear that clouded your judgment, but the consequences of your actions are irreversible. You have taken an innocent life, and for that, you will be held accountable. The verdict came down, and Karen was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted into whispers, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't enough to bring my mother back, but it was something. It was a small measure of justice. As Karen was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. She would have to face the consequences of her actions. But even as the relief settled in, it wasn't enough to take away the pain. The grief, the loss, would always be there. My mother was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. But at least, for now, we had justice. And for my mother, that was the least we could give her. It's been several months since the trial, and I still wake up some mornings feeling like it was all just a nightmare, like any moment I'll open my eyes and find that my mother is still here. But the truth is, she's not. She's gone, and there's nothing in this world that can change that. The hole she left behind is something I don't think any of us will ever truly fill. In the weeks following the verdict, life became a strange, surreal blur. On the outside, things seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy, but I knew better. I could see it in my father's eyes, in the way my siblings no longer laughed the way they used to, in the silence that hung over the dinner table. We had all learned to move through the motions of daily life, but the warmth we once had, that sense of security, that sense of belonging, was gone. I found myself standing in my mother's garden one morning, staring at the flowers she used to tend to with such care. The vibrant colors of the petals still reminded me of her laughter, her love for nature, her endless patience as she nurtured everything around her. But even the beauty of the flowers couldn't hide the truth, she wasn't here to watch them grow anymore. I couldn't bring myself to care for them the way she had, so they began to wither, just like everything else in my life after that day. My father, too, seemed to be unraveling. He had always been a strong, silent type, the kind of man who held his emotions close to his chest. But since my mother's death, I could see the weight of grief in every line of his face. He was still the rock of the family, but even rocks crack under enough pressure. I watched him try to fill the silence with work, burying himself in tasks he could control, hoping it would somehow numb the pain. It didn't. But I knew that neither of us knew how to deal with the grief. The hardest part, though, was learning to live in a world that no longer had her in it. There was no one to call when you needed advice, no one to sit beside you during a storm, no one to offer comfort in the dark. And it wasn't just me, it was everyone who knew her. The community, once so tightly knit, was slowly unraveling. Karen's actions had divided us all. Some neighbors couldn't look at us without guilt in their eyes, while others couldn't understand why we still mourned someone they saw as just another neighbor. We had tried to rebuild our sense of community, but there was an unspoken tension now. The trust had been broken, and it would never be the same. But in the midst of all this chaos, I realized something. I realized that while my mother's absence was unbearable, her spirit still lived on in each of us. She had given us a gift that no one, not even Karen, could take away, the strength to keep going, the love to hold us together, and the lessons to guide us through the darkness. I started to focus on the little things, the things that had once seemed insignificant. I took care of the flowers in my mother's garden, not because I had to, but because she would have wanted me to. I reconnected with the neighbors who still cared, the ones who showed up at the funeral, the ones who never judged us, and began to rebuild the connections that had been lost. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had to try. As for Karen, her actions had changed everything. But they had also shown me just how fragile the line between reality and paranoia could be. It was a line that Karen had crossed, and in doing so, she had destroyed not just my mother's life but also her own. She was no longer a part of this community, and I didn't know if she ever would be again. But I couldn't focus on her anymore. What mattered was us, the people who still cared, who still held on to what really mattered. We still have days when the grief is overwhelming, when the sadness threatens to consume us all. But we've learned to lean on each other, to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of what happened. We've learned that healing isn't linear. Some days are better than others, and some days feel like a step backward. But the important thing is that we're still here. We're still moving forward, even if it's just one tiny step at a time. And through it all, I've learned something profound, something I wish I had known before the tragedy struck. The people we love, the relationships we hold dear, are fragile. They can be taken away in an instant, and once they're gone, there's no getting them back. The lesson, if there is one to take from this, is that we must cherish the moments we have, hold tight to those we love, and never take for granted the things that truly matter. My mother may no longer be here, but her love, her wisdom, and her strength live on in each of us. And as long as I have breath in my body, I will carry her with me, honoring her memory by living the life she would have wanted for me, a life full of love, compassion, and understanding. That is the greatest gift she could have given me, and it's the one thing I will never let go of. How far can fear and suspicion push someone before they lose sight of the truth? Could one moment of panic change the course of an entire life? Karen thought she was protecting her world, but in doing so, she destroyed someone else's. If you were in her shoes, would you have been able to distinguish fear from reality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a reminder of the fine line between trust and fear, and how a single moment can unravel everything. If you found this story powerful and want to hear more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep this conversation going, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one we create in our minds. Stay vigilant, stay kind, and never stop questioning the truth around you. This conclusion invites the audience to reflect on the nature of fear and misunderstanding, encouraging them to engage with the content and share their perspectives. It's a strong call to action that prompts reflection and interaction.